Hello, my audience, dear audience. James almost saw Deep in a scene that few people know about. But if James's secretary knows about Deep's whereabouts, will she protect James or will she plot to abandon Deep to get James? Deep is recovering her memory. What happens when James's secretary, Trang, finds out? The scent of rain still lingered in the air when Deep stood by the window of the small hospital room, staring at the sky as if the answers were hidden in the clouds. Each morning she woke with a sense of haunting déjà vu faces she couldn't name, a man's voice in her dreams calling her name, a piano tune that tugged at her soul. The doctors said she was improving. Her memories were scattered, like puzzle pieces floating just beneath the surface. But she could feel it, someone was missing from her life. At the other end of the city, James sat silently in his office, eyes dark from sleepless nights. He hadn't seen Deep since the accident. He'd been told she had survived, but that she didn't remember him. Not their laughter, not their tears, not the love that once burned between them. And so, he stayed away. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was fear. But fate, as always, had other plans. One morning, as Trang, James's longtime secretary, sorted through the daily reports, she came across a medical file mistakenly sent to the company. Her eyes scanned the name at the top, Deep. Her hands froze. Memory loss, still under observation? The words burned into her like fire. Trang's heart thudded painfully. She had always admired James from afar, watched him fall for Deep, watched him smile differently because of her. But now things had changed. Deep was vulnerable, forgotten, alone, and Trang had a choice. Did she tell James? Did she help him reunite with the woman he never stopped loving? Or did she bury the truth and take the chance to become something more in his life? The war in Trang's heart had begun, and the outcome would shape all their lives. Trang sat alone at her desk long after the office had emptied, the glow of the computer screen reflecting off her tense face. The document with Deep's name still lay open in front of her, mocking her silence. She had read every line Deep's memory loss, her struggle to recover, and her fragile emotional state. Her mind raced with thoughts she didn't want to admit aloud. If Deep no longer remembers James, isn't that a sign, a second chance for both of us? But then a sharper voice inside her whispered, or is it betrayal, to take what never belonged to you? The next morning, James stepped into the office, his usual calm replaced with a heavy stillness. He looked tired, more withdrawn than usual. Trang handed him his schedule, hesitating slightly. "James," she said, her voice soft, "do you still think about her?" He looked up slowly, eyes shadowed with grief. "Every day," he said without pause, "but she doesn't remember me anymore. She's better off without the pain." Trang's heart clenched. It would have been so easy, so convenient, to keep Deep a secret. But now, hearing the ache in his voice, Trang realized something. Love, if real, was not about taking what you wanted, it was about giving what was needed. That afternoon, Trang printed the hospital file and placed it gently on James's desk. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. James stared at the file, his hands trembling slightly as he read the words confirming what he'd only heard in whispers. Deep is alive, Deep is healing, but most importantly, Deep might still come back to him. His eyes met Trang's. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" His voice cracked. Trang swallowed her pride, her hope, and smiled faintly. "Because I was afraid, but more than that, I wanted to do what was right." James didn't say anything, but he stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out without another word. As the office door clicked shut, Trang sat down quietly. She had just lost the man she loved, but for the first time, her heart felt strangely at peace. The hospital was quiet, the kind of stillness that made every footstep feel like a thunderclap. James stood outside room 207, his hand hovering near the doorknob. He hadn't seen her in weeks, not since the day she disappeared, not since the accident that took her memories. And his peace, his fingers curled into a fist. What if she doesn't remember me at all? Worse, What if she does, but wishes she didn't? Taking a shaky breath, he pushed the door open. Deep sat near the window, bathed in the soft gold of the afternoon light. She wore a loose cream sweater, her hair tied back, a book resting in her lap. Her eyes turned toward the door and locked on him. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then she frowned slightly, tilting her head. "Do I know you?" James's heart cracked, but he managed to smile. "Not anymore, but I think we used to mean something to each other." Deep blinked slowly, studying his face. "You seem familiar. There's something in your eyes." "Something warm." She looked down. "I've been told my memories might come back, piece by piece. Some faces I see in dreams, some voices echo." James stepped closer, afraid to hope. "I don't want to force anything. I just wanted to see you, to make sure you're okay." She nodded, and then hesitated. "James," she said softly. He froze. "What did you say?" She looked startled. I don't know. It just came out." Tears gathered in his eyes, unbidden. "That's my name." Deep touched her temple, confused but suddenly emotional. "Why does it hurt when I say it?" James knelt beside her chair, his voice thick. "Because once we were everything to each other, and maybe deep down, your heart still remembers what your mind has forgotten." Her fingers brushed his cheek gently, as if trying to feel something lost. Maybe it does. And for the first time in weeks, James felt something stir inside him, not just hope, but the beginning of healing for both of them. That night, Deep lay in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. The warmth in James's eyes lingered in her thoughts, more vivid than anything else she'd experienced since the accident. His name echoed in her mind, James, a name that felt like it belonged to her heart. She turned slightly and reached for the small notebook, where she tried to write fragments of what she could remember. There, under yesterday's shaky drawing of a sunflower, she scribbled, "James, his eyes make me feel safe. My chest hurts when I see him. Is this love?" Meanwhile, outside the hospital, James stood beneath the amber glow of the parking lot light, his hands clenched in his coat pockets. Trang, his secretary, approached quietly from behind. She had followed him ever since she overheard the nurses mention Deep's name at reception. "You didn't tell me she was alive," Trang said, her voice steady, but her eyes flickered with something unreadable. James turned to her, startled. "Trang, I didn't know how to say it. Everything's been so uncertain. She's lost her memory?" Trang asked, her tone softening slightly. James nodded. "Yes, she doesn't remember me, not fully. But something inside her does, I think." Trang looked away, the corners of her mouth tightening. She had loved James in silence for years. Watching him break slowly over another woman, one who couldn't even remember him, was more painful than she'd ever imagined. But now, watching his devotion, she felt something shift inside her, bitterness, and a decision. "You think she'll recover?" she asked. "I don't know," James replied honestly. "But I'll wait, no matter how long it takes." Trang's jaw tightened. What if she never remembers? What if she falls for someone else during this blank chapter of her life? James gave her a long, tired look. "If that's what her heart leads her to, I'll accept it. I love her too much to hold her hostage to a past she no longer sees." Trang's breath caught. Something cold and sharp twisted in her chest. "You're a fool, James." "No," he whispered. "I'm just in love." As he walked away, Trang stood motionless under the street lamp, her expression unreadable. She glanced back up to the hospital window, where Deep now stood, watching the world below her, hand pressed lightly against the glass. She didn't know why, but the sight of James walking away made her feel like something precious was slipping through her fingers. The morning air was cool and tinged with the scent of blooming frangipani outside the hospital windows. Deep sat in the hospital garden, a plaid blanket draped across her lap, watching as golden light filtered through the leaves. A familiar voice startled her. "You're up early." She turned to find Officer Kong standing a few feet away, dressed in plain clothes, but with the unmistakable calm authority in his posture. His eyes softened as they met hers. Deep smiled faintly. "I couldn't sleep. My dreams are confusing lately. They feel like memories trying to resurface." Kong walked closer, sitting beside her on the bench. He handed her a paper cup of warm tea. "Chamomile. Thought it might help." She accepted it with a nod. "Thank you, again." He looked at her carefully. "Do you remember anything more?" Deep hesitated. "Pieces. Emotions, mostly. There's this man. His name is James. When I see him, my heart aches, but I don't know if it's from love or pain." Kong looked away for a moment. "Sometimes, love feels like both." His voice was quiet. There was something in his eyes, gentle, unspoken affection that made Deep's heart flutter, though it confused her even more. She had been saved by this man. He had been there when no one else was. His calm presence grounded her. And now, he was here again, bringing her warmth when the world still felt foreign. Just then, footsteps approached. James. His gaze locked onto hers instantly, but then shifted briefly to Kong, and something unreadable flashed across his face. "I didn't realize you had company," he said, his voice polite, though taut beneath the surface. Deep glanced between the two men. The silence thickened, like the calm before a storm. Kong stood, offering a respectful nod. "I was just leaving. Take care," Deep. As he walked away, James sat down in the now empty space beside her. "You seem close to him," he said quietly. Deep stared down at her tea. "He was the one who found me after the accident. He stayed with me when I was afraid. I guess he made me feel safe." James swallowed hard. "I understand." Silence again. Then she turned to him. "But you make me feel something else entirely." James looked at her, his eyes full of both hope and hurt. "What is it that I make you feel?" She searched for the words. "Like I once loved you so deeply that forgetting it feels like a kind of betrayal. And yet, I don't remember why." James gently reached for her hand. "Then let me help you remember. Not just with memories, but with moments." She didn't pull away. Far from them, hidden behind a pillar of the hospital, stood Trang. She had seen everything: Kang's quiet devotion, James's gentle desperation, and Deep caught in the storm of it all. And in Trang's heart, something dark began to twist. This wasn't over. Not yet. Life lesson: when the heart forgets, let kindness help it remember. Sometimes life shatters what we thought was unbreakable: our memories, our trust, or the love we once held dear. In Deep's story, memory loss wasn't just a physical condition, it was a symbol of emotional healing. She stood between two men, one from her past, one from her present, and each represented a different kind of love, one rooted in history, the other in gentle patience. But while Deep struggled to remember who she used to be, what truly mattered wasn't just the return of old memories. It was how people treated her in the fragile present. James tried to reconnect through love and honesty. Kong offered quiet protection without expectation. Trang, however, let jealousy grow in silence. The lesson is this: love is not just in grand gestures or passionate words, it's in how we show up when someone is at their most vulnerable. It's in patience, in respect, in putting someone's healing above our pride. We all face moments when people around us are forgetting who they were, who we were to them, or how things used to be. In those moments, may we choose empathy over pressure, support over suspicion, and love that is selfless over love that demands. Because in the end, memories may fade, but the way we make others feel will always leave a mark.